I want you to imagine something with me for a moment. Not because the moment is beautiful, but because it changed the direction of an entire family. Sometimes life doesn't warn you before it throws a storm at your face, literally or emotionally. And sometimes the people you expect to treat you with respect become the very ones who test your patience, your boundaries, and your dignity. But it is in those tests that something inside you awakens, something quiet, but stronger than anger, something deeper than pride. And that moment came for me in the shape of a bowl of hot soup. It was supposed to be an ordinary afternoon, a simple family lunch, nothing more. The kind where everyone sits together, pretends to be polite, nods at each other's words, and keeps the peace even when the air is thick with unspoken tension. I had prepared myself mentally for that kind of afternoon. I knew she didn't like me. I knew she thought I wasn't good enough, or modern enough, or stylish enough, or whatever. New complaint she added to her list on that particular day, but disliking someone is one thing. Acting on that dislike is something else entirely. And yet, I walked into that house with a smile, not for her approval, but for my son, for the love that tied our families together, for the hope that maybe one day peace would settle in the cracks between us. I had no idea that this would be the day everything changed, not gradually, not softly, but in one loud, burning moment. She was already upset when I walked in. You can always tell when someone's anger fills the room before they do. It sits in the air, thick and warm, like something you could touch. But I didn't want to start anything. I greeted her politely. She barely answered. That wasn't new. So I took my seat quietly at the table. She went into the kitchen, and I could hear the clatter of steel, the sharp movements of someone who isn't cooking but punishing the utensils. Still, I stayed calm. I have lived long enough to know that every storm eventually rains itself out. I didn't know that this one wasn't coming from the sky. It was being heated on a stove. When she returned, she carried the pot in her hands, steam rising like a warning I didn't see in time. I looked up at her, expecting her to place it on the table. Instead, she stood right in front of me, her hands tightened around the handles, her eyes locked onto mine, not with confusion, not with carelessness, but with something deliberate. Something sharp, something dangerous. And in the next second, before I could move, before I could breathe, before I could understand what was happening, she lifted that pot and threw the soup hot, burning, fresh from her hands straight into my face. The world did not explode with sound. It actually fell silent. Pain doesn't always scream. Sometimes it shocks you into a silence, so deep that you hear your heartbeat before you feel your skin burn. The soup splashed over my face, my neck, my clothes. The heat hit me like someone had opened a furnace door in front of me. I gasped, not because I was weak, but because my body didn't know how to respond to something so sudden. My first instinct was to stand. My second was to protect my face. My third was nothing, because in that moment, the pain wasn't the thing that shook me the most. It was the intention, the awareness that a woman who shared a roof with my son, who was supposed to be family, had decided that hurting me wasn't enough, humiliating me was the goal. But here's the thing about life's cruel moments. They do not define you unless you pick them up and hold them tight. They do not ruin you unless you allow them to take root. And as the soup slid down my cheeks, dripping onto the floor, leaving a trail of pain behind, something rose inside me that I hadn't expected. Calmness. A calmness that didn't come from weakness, but from clarity. She wanted me to scream. She wanted me to shout. She wanted me to lose control so she could point and say, "See? This is who she really is." She wanted a reaction that would justify her violence, but instead of giving her what she wanted, I took a slow breath. Even with the heat burning my skin, I didn't lift my voice. I didn't lash out. I didn't throw anything back. There is a strength in choosing silence at the exact moment someone expects your explosion. Because silence is not surrender. Silence is observation. Silence is control. Silence is the moment you decide that the story being written about you will not be written by the one who wants to see you fall. She stepped back after throwing the soup. Maybe she expected me to fight. Maybe she expected me to collapse. Maybe she expected the chaos of yelling and crying and accusing. But instead, she saw something she had never seen in me before. A woman who was hurt, but unbroken. A woman who felt pain, but refused to let anger guide her. A woman who had every right to retaliate, yet chose dignity. She wasn't prepared for that. And I could see the confusion in her eyes, like she was waiting for the next move in a play she had written for me, but I wasn't following her script. That moment taught me something important. People who thrive on hurting others fear most the people who remain calm in the fire. I gently wiped my face with my scarf. My hands were trembling, not from fear, but from the shock of what had just happened. I could feel the burning on my skin, but I didn't cry, not because it didn't hurt, but because crying would have made her believe she had won something. Winning doesn't always happen in loud moments. Sometimes it happens in the quiet decision to hold your head high when someone tries to drag you low. She started talking fast, defensive, excuses that didn't make sense. It was an accident. The pot slipped. You were in the way. Lies that fell apart the moment they left her mouth. Lies that she told herself so she wouldn't have to face what she had done. But I didn't argue. I didn't correct her. I let her speak. Let her panic. Let her reveal more of herself through her fear than she ever could through her anger. Because sometimes the person who hurts you will expose themselves without you having to say a single word. I stood there, breathing slowly, feeling the heat on my skin. I realized something. There are battles you fight with your hands, and there are battles you fight with your character. And this was one of those moments where character was louder than any retaliation I could have chosen. You see, dignity isn't measured by how you treat people who treat you well. It's measured by how you behave when someone tries to strip your dignity away. And no matter what she did, she couldn't take away what I had built inside myself. Over a lifetime, the inner strength to rise without stepping on anyone else. I walked to the sink, splashed cool water on my face, and felt the burn ease a little. My hand still shook, but my heart was steady. When I finally walked back into the room, she looked at me like she wasn't sure if she should feel guilt or fear or anger. But that wasn't my responsibility. I had one mission in that moment: protect my peace. Because when someone attacks you unjustly, the first thing they expect is your reaction. But when they don't get it, they lose their power. I sat down again, not because I wanted to continue the meal, but because I wanted her to see that she couldn't push me out of the room. She couldn't force me to leave. She couldn't erase my presence. I existed before her attack. I existed during it. And I existed after it, stronger than she expected. Being hurt doesn't make you weak. Staying graceful while hurt makes you unstoppable. She avoided my eyes. She fidgeted with her hands. Her plan had gone wrong. Not because the soup didn't hit me, but because the reaction she wanted didn't come. Her victory had slipped out of her fingers. She had thrown the soup, but I had refused to throw my piece. And in that moment, for the first time, she realized something. I was not the woman she thought she could break. I was not the woman she could intimidate. I was not the woman she could shape or silence. I was the woman who understood that power is not loud. It is steady. It is quiet. It is rooted. What happened next? Well, that part of the story came later. But everything changed the moment that soup touched my skin and my silence answered her violence. Because that was the moment the truth revealed itself, not about me, but about her. And that truth would soon unfold in ways she never expected, in ways that shaped the future of our families in a direction she could no longer control. And that moment became the beginning of everything that followed. When I look back on that moment, the moment right after the soup hit my face, it isn't the burn that I remember first. It isn't even the shock. What I remember most vividly is the strange, deep silence inside me. You would think that after being attacked so suddenly, so violently, person would react with anger or outrage, or at least with confusion. But inside me, there was a stillness so profound that it almost surprised me more than the soup itself. It felt like the world had frozen in that instant, as if time was waiting for me to decide who I wanted to be next. People often assume that strength shows itself in loud ways, in shouting, in fighting back, in proving yourself right. But the truth is, real strength rarely arrives with noise. It comes quietly, like a soft voice in the middle of chaos, guiding you toward the path you know you won't regret later. And that voice spoke to me in that moment, telling me not to react. Not because I was weak, but because reacting would have handed her control of the story she wanted to write. The silence before the storm wasn't forced, it was chosen. Chosen because I knew that some battles are won in movement, but others are won in stillness. Some people expect you to mirror their anger, to reflect their bitterness, to become the version of yourself that they can blame. But what happens when you refuse? What happens when the one being provoked stands still, steady, unshaken? The person trying to break you becomes confused. Their script falls apart. Their power dissolves. And that is exactly what happened. After the soup hit me, she stood there with her eyes wide, not because she felt sorry, but because she was waiting for the explosion she believed would justify her cruelty. She needed me to react. She needed me to scream so she could tell everyone, see? This is why I don't like her. She needed drama to cover her guilt. But instead of giving her noise, I gave her silence. That silence wasn't empty. It was full of clarity, full of awareness, full of the realization that if I chose to respond with anger, I would lose more than I gained. I would lose my peace, my self-respect, and the moral truth that was on my side. I've lived long enough to know that a moment of rage can undo years of dignity, and I wasn't about to let a single act of cruelty rewrite who I was, so I breathed. Slowly, while the soup slid down my face, I inhaled deeply, letting the breath steady my trembling chest. My skin burned, but my heart remained anchored. I didn't lift my voice. I didn't throw anything. I didn't even ask her why, because sometimes asking why only gives the other person another weapon. Sometimes the best answer is allowing silence to expose the truth without your help. I could feel the heat cooling on my skin as the air touched it, but inside, something else was happening. It felt like a quiet transformation, not a change in who I was, but a strengthening of everything I'd learned throughout my life lesson about patience, about pride, about not allowing someone else's bitterness to stain your character. She expected me to crumble. She expected the fragile version of me that existed only in her imagination. But when I didn't break, when I didn't shout, when I didn't give her anything to work with, her confidence cracked. She looked at me like she didn't recognize the person sitting in front of her. And maybe she didn't. She had created her own version of me. A woman she thought she could intimidate, manipulate, and belittle. But in that moment, she saw the real me, someone she never took the time to understand. I stayed calm, not because I didn't feel the pain, but because I refused to let that pain lead me. People who act out of pain often regret the outcome. People who act out of clarity rarely do. And the clarity I felt in that moment told me that my silence was louder than any accusation I could have spoken. She started scrambling for excuses, blaming the pot, the angle, the floor, anything she could invent. But the words came out rushed and shaky. Her excuses weren't for me, they were for herself. It was her conscience she was trying to quiet, and I let her speak, let her scramble, let her unravel in the presence of her own actions. I didn't interrupt. I didn't correct her. I simply watched her reveal her own truth. Staying calm wasn't about being passive. It was about being in complete control. Sometimes calmness is the strongest form of protest, the loudest expression of self-respect, the clearest boundary you can draw without raising your voice. And that is what happened in that moment. I didn't need to point fingers. I didn't need to accuse her. My calmness drew a line she couldn't cross, and with every second that passed without a reaction from me, I could feel the power shifting in the room. She wasn't the powerful one anymore. The person who attacks loses power the moment the victim refuses to participate in their chaos. She wanted a fight. But fights require two people. I refused to join her battlefield, and that refusal shook her more than any retaliation could have. I walked to the sink on steady feet, though my legs were trembling inside, not because I was afraid of her, but because the weight of the moment was heavy. Sometimes strength feels like shaking inside while standing still on the outside. I splashed cool water on my face, letting it soothe the burning, and I watched the soup stain slip away from my skin. But what it left behind wasn't weakness. It was a new understanding of who I was capable of being. When I returned to the room, she couldn't meet my eyes. Her head was lowered, her fingers twisting nervously. It wasn't remorse. It was fear. Not fear of me, but fear of the truth she had revealed about herself. Fear of what happens when someone sees who you really are while staying composed the entire time. I sat down again, not to act like nothing happened, but to show her something unmistakable. She could not remove me from the space with her actions. She could not push me out of that room. She could not erase my presence with a bowl of soup. I sat down to reclaim the dignity she tried to strip from me, and in doing so, I reclaimed control. My silence became her mirror, reflecting everything she didn't want to see. People who carry hatred depend on the reactions of others to validate their behavior. When you take that reaction away, they are forced to face themselves, and facing yourself is often harder than facing any opponent. Inside me, the calmness wasn't emptiness. It was a decision to rise above the ugliness placed before me, a decision to be the adult in a moment where another adult chose childishness, a decision to protect my peace, even while someone tried to shatter it. Because protecting yourself isn't always about fighting back. Sometimes it's about refusing to fall into the trap someone sets for you. And as I sat there, breathing steadily, the room felt different. The air had shifted, the balance had changed. She had thrown the soup, but I had thrown away the reaction she wanted. And in that rejection, I found strength. A strength that told me I didn't need to defend myself. The silence itself had already done that. Keeping calm didn't mean I had forgiven her in that moment. It didn't mean I wasn't hurt. It didn't mean I didn't feel the sting on my skin or the deeper sting in my heart. What it meant was that I chose to rise. Rising doesn't require wings. Sometimes it only requires restraint. In the silence before the storm, I found a peace that her actions couldn't touch, a peace rooted in the knowledge that no matter what someone does to you, you decide who you become next. And I chose to become someone stronger, not someone bitter. People often say silence is weakness, but I don't agree. Silence can be power. Silence can be protection. Silence can be the moment you gather yourself before showing the world that you are bigger than the pain thrown at you. That day, my calmness became the first step toward everything that would unfold later: the confrontation, the truth, the shift in family dynamics, the unexpected support that rose in my favor, and the consequences she never saw coming. But it all began with that one choice. The choice not to fuel her fire. When I think about the moment my son finally learned the truth, it feels like the world held its breath with me. There are moments in life where you already know someone's reaction before they even arrive, and then there are moments where you can't predict anything. This one belonged to the second category. I didn't know whether he would explode with anger, break down with sadness, or remain frozen with disbelief. All I knew was that when he walked into that house, the energy shifted completely, like the air itself sensed that something enormous was about to unfold. I didn't tell him what had happened right away, not because I wanted to protect her, and not because I was scared of his reaction, but because I needed a moment to sit with myself before I sat with the truth. When someone hurts you physically, the pain lasts only a few minutes, but when someone tries to humiliate you emotionally, that pain lingers deep inside, settling in places you didn't know existed. I needed a few breaths before I said anything to him, not to gather courage, but to gather clarity. He came in with his usual energy, the kind of energy that always reminded me of the child he used to be. He had no idea the storm that had passed through the house only moments before he arrived. He noticed my face first, not the redness, not the slight swelling, but the silence. A silence he wasn't used to seeing on me. That's how well children know us. Even when they grow up, even when they move out, even when they build new families, they can still sense when something is wrong with the woman who raised them. He looked at me closely. He studied my expression like someone trying to solve a puzzle without all the pieces. And then his eyes went to the floor, where a faint trail of soup stained the tiles. The pot still sat on the counter, tilted awkwardly, as if trying to hide the evidence of what had been done. And she shifted her weight nervously, trying to appear busy, but the truth was written all over her body language. My son turned back to me, waiting. That was the moment I understood something important. He trusted my silence more than her explanation. He didn't ask her first. He didn't accept her side before hearing mine. He simply waited for me to speak, because he knew that whatever I said would be the truth. I didn't dramatize anything. I didn't exaggerate. I didn't raise my voice. I simply told him what happened as calmly as I could, telling the story the same way it happened. No additions, no ornaments, no emotional manipulation. Just truth. Pure truth. His face changed in stages: first confusion, then disbelief, then a slow build of emotion that I couldn't quite name at first. And as he absorbed my words, everything around us felt like it was holding its breath. Even the walls seemed to lean in closer. People talk about anger, but they don't talk about the silence that comes before anger: the tightness in the jaw, the slight rise in the chest, the narrowing of the eyes, the stillness in the entire body. That was the silence I saw in him. A silence, not of acceptance, but of shock, so sharp that it froze him temporarily. He turned to look at her, and the room shifted again. And for the first time since the soup hit my skin, I saw something in her eyes: fear. Not fear of consequences, but fear of exposure. Fear that her carefully constructed image was about to crumble in front of the one person whose opinion mattered most to her. She started speaking before he asked a single question. She rushed into defenses, excuses, stories that didn't make sense. She tried to twist the narrative into an accident, a misunderstanding, a miscalculation. But the more she spoke, the more tangled her words became, like someone trying to climb out of quicksand only to sink deeper. My son listened for a few seconds, but he wasn't listening to understand her. He was listening to hear the holes in her story. He was listening to see if her words aligned with the truth he already sensed in his bones. A child may grow up, but a child always knows the tone of honesty in their parent's voice, and he could hear it in mine. He asked her one question, not 10, not 20, just one: why. It was a simple word, but it sliced through the air sharper than any shout could have. And she didn't have a real answer, because there was no answer that could make what she had done acceptable. There was no excuse that could soften the intention behind her action. The truth was ugly, and she knew it. And ugliness revealed under the light of honesty has nowhere to hide. My son's face went cold, not the coldness of hatred, But the coldness of betrayal. Betrayal doesn't always come from lies. Sometimes it comes from witnessing cruelty you never believed someone was capable of. He walked toward me and gently touched my cheek, careful not to press too hard where the redness still lingered. That small gesture, that soft touch, said everything he didn't need to put into words. It said that he believed me. It said that he was hurt for me. It said that the foundation of respect between us was unshakable. But what he said next was something I'll never forget. He didn't shout. He didn't insult her. He didn't throw accusations. He spoke in a controlled, steady tone that carried more weight than any loud declaration could. He said, "There's no world where this is okay." Those words weren't loud, but they were powerful, because they came from a place of love, loyalty, and moral clarity. He wasn't just defending me as his mother. He was defending the principle of respect that should exist in any family. And in that moment, she realized something she never considered before, that her actions didn't just target me. They targeted the relationship he had with her. They targeted his trust, his peace, his image of the person he believed she was. The biggest damage she caused had nothing to do with the soup. It was the fracture she created in her own relationship with him. When someone hurts you, they think the consequences will fall on you. But sometimes, those consequences fall hardest on the person who committed the harm. She tried to speak again, but he raised his hand slightly, a gesture that said, "No more lies." And she stopped. The room fell into a silence so thick, it felt like it was pressing against my skin. He didn't need to shout at her. His silence was more powerful than any yelling could have been. He turned back to me and said, "This won't happen again." It wasn't a promise made out of anger. It was a vow made out of love. A vow that something had shifted inside him. A vow that he would handle what needed to be handled. And in that moment, I saw the little boy I raised transform into the man I always hoped he would be. He didn't blame me for staying calm. He didn't question why I didn't defend myself. Instead, he admired the restraint, understood the gravity, and felt protective of the woman who had always protected him. The house suddenly felt smaller, as if too many truths had been forced into its walls all at once. She stood there, staring at him, realizing that her plan had backfired in ways she never imagined. She thought attacking me would weaken me. Instead, it strengthened the bond between my son and me in a way she could never undo. He helped me out of the room, not because I needed assistance, but because he needed to physically distance me from the source of the pain. That's the thing about children, they can tolerate pain for themselves, but they have very little tolerance for seeing their parents hurt. It touches a place inside them that childhood memories live in, a place that never grows old, never hardens. And when we reached the doorway, he looked back at her with an expression that said everything he didn't say aloud. It said that something inside him had changed forever. It said that trust once broken cannot return to its original shape. It said that the version of her he grew up believing in no longer existed. Sometimes the truth doesn't shout. Sometimes it breaks quietly inside a person, and you can see the pieces fall in their eyes. That day, my son didn't just learn what she had done, he learned who she had chosen to be. And once someone shows you who they are, the relationship shifts permanently, no matter how much time passes afterward. Because when my son learned the truth, it didn't just shake the household, it changed the direction of the story completely. When the time came for the truth to be confronted, it didn't arrive with shouting or slamming doors. It didn't come with dramatic threats or loud accusations. It came quietly, the way important moments often do, slowly, steadily, like the truth itself had decided it was tired of being held back. The confrontation wasn't something I planned. It wasn't even something I wanted. It was something that simply became unavoidable, because once a line has been crossed, pretending nothing happened becomes a burden too heavy to carry for anyone involved. After my son learned what had happened, the house entered a strange stillness, like a pause between two breaths. You know that feeling when everyone knows something is wrong, but no one knows how to take the first step toward addressing it. That tension sat in the room like a third presence, invisible but undeniable. Even she felt it. You could see it in the way she avoided eye contact, in the way she shifted from foot to foot, in the way her voice stayed trapped in her throat every time she tried to speak. My son didn't rush into confrontation. That's something I love about him. He doesn't explode emotionally or react impulsively. He carries his feelings with purpose. He lets them settle, shape themselves, and then he acts. That day, he quietly walked into the living room and asked everyone to sit down. There was no anger in his voice, but there was a firmness, a kind of authority that made it clear this wasn't a request. It was a moment that needed to happen. I sat down because he asked me to, but she hesitated. That hesitation said more than any words could. People hesitate when they fear the outcome of the truth. She stood there, arms crossed tightly over her chest, like someone preparing for an attack. But the attack wasn't going to come from us. The only attack happening in that moment was the battle she was having inside her own conscience, wrestling with guilt she didn't want to acknowledge. When she finally sat down, she tried to position herself in a way that made her look composed, but her trembling fingers betrayed her. The room felt heavy with everything unspoken. My son looked at her, not with hatred, but with disappointment that cut deeper than anger ever could. Disappointment always stings more, because it means someone expected better from you. He asked her to explain what happened. No accusations, no assumptions, just an open door for honesty. But honesty is a door not everyone is brave enough to walk through. She started speaking, but her voice cracked under the weight of her own lies. She blamed the pot again, blamed her grip, blamed everything except her own intention. The more she spoke, the more tangled her story became, until even she couldn't keep track of the version she was trying to sell. My son didn't interrupt her. He let her speak until her words wrapped around her like a cage. Lies can feel like protection in the moment, but eventually they become the walls that trap you. When her excuses ran out, the silence fell again, this time heavier, almost suffocating. He turned to me, not to question, but to confirm. All I did was nod. It was a small gesture, but it carried the weight of truth, and that simple nod seemed to break something open in the room. Not loudly, not violently, quietly, like a crack forming in a glass that had been under pressure for too long. That's when he asked her the question that changed everything. What did you want to happen? It wasn't asked with anger, it was asked with clarity. A clarity that demanded more than excuses, it demanded accountability. And she couldn't hide behind excuses anymore. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. She looked at him, at me, and then at the floor, as if searching for a version of herself that she could defend. But there wasn't one. When truth exposes someone's intentions, it does so gently at first, giving them a chance to step into honesty. But if they refuse that chance, the truth becomes sharper, clearer, impossible to escape. And that's what happened in that moment. She finally muttered something about frustration, about feeling disrespected, about wanting to put me in my place. Those words didn't come out confidently. They came out reluctantly, slipping through clenched teeth like they were pulled from her against her will, but they were the truth. And once they were spoken, there was no taking them back. My son inhaled slowly, absorbing her admission, letting it settle inside him. Betrayal isn't always about actions. Sometimes it's about intentions. Being physically attacked hurts, but knowing someone wanted to hurt you, that leaves a deeper wound. He leaned back, processing everything, and the disappointment in his eyes deepened into something quieter, sadder. She looked at him, expecting him to soften, to defend her, to take her side. But he didn't. He simply asked, "Why would you want to hurt her?" That question was the real confrontation. Not the incident, not the lies, not the excuses. It was that simple question. And she couldn't answer because the truth behind it wasn't pretty. It wasn't something she wanted to admit aloud. It was jealousy, insecurity, resentment, all the emotions she had tried to disguise behind politeness and forced smiles. The masks fell off in that moment. Not because we tore them off, but because the truth made them too heavy to hold up anymore. People don't realize how much effort it takes to maintain a facade. They think pretending is easy, but carrying a false version of yourself every day is exhausting. And eventually something happens, a mistake, a slip, a moment of carelessness, and the mask falls. Once it falls, it can't be put back on the same way. She finally broke down, not in remorse for hurting me, but in fear of losing the image she tried to maintain. Tears didn't come from guilt. They came from panic. And my son saw that. He saw that the tears weren't apologies. They were desperation. Desperation to rebuild the mask, to rewrite the narrative, to regain the control she felt slipping out of her hands. But it was too late. He didn't lash out. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't insult her. His calmness was the mirror she didn't want to look into. When someone chooses calmness during a confrontation, it isn't weakness. It is clarity. It is confidence. It is knowing that the truth doesn't need volume to be heard. After a long moment of silence, he said, "This family cannot survive if we pretend this didn't happen." That sentence hit the room like a quiet storm. She looked up at him, her eyes searching for softness, but found none. Not because he was cold, but because he was clear. Clarity feels cold to people who rely on confusion. Clarity exposes everything. He stood up, not in anger, but in decision. The confrontation had reached its natural end. The truth had been spoken. The masks had fallen, and there was no more room for pretending. She tried to follow him, reaching out as if grabbing his arm could pull back the moment. But he stepped away gently, creating a space she had never expected to see between them, a space created by her own actions. That is the thing about intentions. They reveal themselves whether we want them to or not. They show up in our worst moments, in the slips, in the mistakes, in the reactions we can't control. And once intentions are exposed, everything changes. Relationships shift. Dynamics rearrange themselves. Trust breaks quietly, like a glass that doesn't shatter but cracks invisibly all the way through. He walked toward me and gave me a look that said everything. Not pity, not regret. Understanding and gratitude. Gratitude that I had stayed calm. Gratitude that I hadn't retaliated. Gratitude that I had shown him the truth, not through shouting, but through dignity. And as she sat there, watching him stand by me, she realized the full weight of what she had done. She hadn't just thrown soup at me. She had thrown away the respect he had for her. She had thrown away the chance to be the kind of person he could admire. She had thrown away the mask she used to hide behind. The confrontation ended not with anger, but with truth. Truth spoken, truth revealed, truth accepted. And truth, once seen, can never be unseen. Because in the end, the moment she revealed her intentions was the moment everything changed forever. You know, there's a moment in every storm where you stop looking at the rain and start waiting for the rainbow. Not because the storm has ended, but because something inside you begins to shift. Something inside you begins to whisper, hold on. Someone, somewhere is going to show up for you in a way you never expected. And that is exactly what happened to me. I had spent days trying to process what happened, the attack, the humiliation, the silence, the shock that rippled through the entire household. Everyone was walking around on eggshells. Everyone felt the tension, even if they didn't dare admit it out loud. But I didn't expect any help from anyone, not because I didn't deserve it, but because I had become used to fighting my own battles. I had spent years being the one who held families together, the one who smoothed edges, the one who absorbed the sharpness of other people's words so the next generation wouldn't bleed from them. I had spent a lifetime giving, forgiving, and overlooking. So I didn't stand there waiting for support. I didn't wait for someone to say, you didn't deserve this. I didn't wait for someone to stand beside me. I didn't expect anyone to stand between me and the storm. But sometimes, life surprises you from the most unexpected corners, often the corners we never thought light could reach. You see, after that entire incident, the house had gone strangely quiet. The kind of quiet that doesn't feel peaceful. The kind of quiet that feels like a question no one wants to answer. The kind of quiet that feels like truth hiding behind closed doors. People were watching me, watching her, watching him, watching each other. All of us pretending nothing happened, but knowing everything had changed. I kept to myself, not out of fear, not out of shame, but because I was choosing silence over chaos. I was choosing restraint over reaction. I was choosing dignity over drama. And let me tell you, silence is powerful, but it can also be misunderstood. Some people think silence means weakness. Some people think silence means surrender. But the wise ones understand silence is strength wrapped in patience. And that patience was what led to the moment that changed everything for me. It happened in the late afternoon when the sun was soft and the day was starting to settle. I was sitting in the living room reflecting on everything that had unfolded. My heart was heavy, but it wasn't broken. It was bruised, yes, but not beyond repair. I was thinking about my son, how torn he must be, how confused, how disappointed. I was thinking about the mill, how guilt and ego were probably wrestling inside her. And I was thinking about myself, how I would move forward with grace, regardless of how deeply the attack had cut. And then suddenly I heard footsteps, not hurried, not hesitant, just steady, purposeful. And for a brief second, I wondered if I was ready for another confrontation. But when I lifted my eyes, what I saw was not confrontation at all. It was compassion. A softness I didn't expect to see, and it came from someone I least expected, someone who had always stayed neutral, someone who had always stayed in the background, someone who had never stepped into drama before because they didn't want to take sides. Yet on that day, they chose. They made a choice I never thought they would make. They sat with me, not across the room, not at a distance, not with their body half turned away. They sat right next to me, shoulder to shoulder, like someone saying without words, "You're not alone right now." Not today. They didn't start with questions. They didn't start with judgments. They didn't start with what they thought I should do. They simply began with the one thing I hadn't heard since everything happened, kindness. They looked me straight in the eyes with a sincerity that caught me off guard and said something so simple, yet so powerful, that it felt like someone had opened all the windows in a suffocating room. They said, "You didn't deserve what happened to you. And I'm sorry you went through that. Those words, those few gentle words, were like water on a fire I didn't realize was still burning inside me. It wasn't the apology that changed something in me, it was the acknowledgement. The validation, the moment someone finally stood up and said, "You were wronged. And I see you." Sometimes we hold pain inside because we think no one sees it. Sometimes we begin to doubt our own hurt because no one around us mirrors it back. When you're attacked, when you're disrespected, when you're humiliated, the wound itself is painful, but the silence afterward, the lack of support, the absence of someone standing up for you, that can cut even deeper. So when this person spoke, when they offered me truth wrapped in gentleness, it didn't just comfort me, it restored something in me. Something I didn't realize had quietly started to crumble. They went on, speaking softly, but with a firmness that surprised me. They told me they had seen everything, the tension, the hostility, the ways I had been treated even before the attack. They told me that sometimes people show their worst behavior not because of something you did, but because of something they're battling inside themselves. They told me jealousy, insecurity, fear of losing control, all those emotions had been simmering long before that soup ever left her hand. And then they told me something that I think will stay with me forever. Some people break others because they don't know how to heal themselves. That single line shifted my entire perspective. For the first time, I saw the situation not just through the lens of my pain, but through the lens of someone else's brokenness, not to excuse it, but to understand it. Not to justify it, but to put it into context. And that understanding didn't heal the wound, but it softened the edges around it. But what moved me even more was what happened next. They told me that they had spoken with others, that conversations were happening behind closed doors, that people who had been silent were starting to speak, that the truth was becoming clear, that the attack had stirred something in everyone, something they could no longer ignore. They told me my calmness, my silence, my restraint, those things had spoken louder than anger ever could. They told me the way I handled myself had made people rethink their loyalty, rethink their assumptions, rethink the entire family dynamic. I didn't realize it until that moment, but my response had created a ripple, a quiet, steady ripple that moved from person to person, shifting perspectives, opening eyes. And this person, the one sitting beside me, gently holding space for me, was the first to step forward and acknowledge what that ripple had done. They told me I had handled the situation with more grace than anyone else could have. They told me I had shown strength, even in stillness. And then, with a kind of conviction that made my throat tighten, they said, "I am with you. Not secretly, not silently. I am with you openly." That meant more to me than I can ever explain. Support is easy when it's loud and public. It's a bit like applause after a performance. But support that arrives quietly, unannounced, unprompted, that's the kind of support that reaches places inside you applause can never touch. That support didn't change the past, but it changed the environment I was standing in. It changed the atmosphere around me. It changed the emotional temperature of the whole situation. It made the weight I was carrying feel lighter because suddenly I wasn't carrying it alone anymore. And when one person stands with you, others often follow. Not because they're influenced, but because they're inspired. Because courage, even silent courage, makes people reevaluate the things they were too afraid to say before. In the days that followed, I began noticing subtle shifts, small gestures, softer tones, people watching me not with curiosity, but with concern, people checking in without making it obvious, people beginning to understand that what had happened wasn't drama, it was cruelty. And cruelty doesn't belong in families, but the greatest shift wasn't in the household, it was in me, with that unexpected support. With that gentle presence beside me, something inside me began to heal. Not completely, not instantly, but enough to remind me that even in painful moments, grace attracts goodness, strength attracts respect, dignity attracts support, and silence, when chosen wisely, attracts truth. I learned something powerful through that unexpected ally, that we don't always need an army to stand with us. Sometimes all we need is one voice, one presence, one soul brave enough to say, "You deserved better." And when that person steps forward, the darkness inside the situation begins to lose its power. Support doesn't always arrive with noise. Sometimes it arrives with stillness. Sometimes it arrives with a hand resting gently on yours. Sometimes it arrives with a single, honest sentence. Sometimes it arrives in the form of someone choosing to sit beside you when they could have walked past you. And when it arrives, you realize you were never as alone as you thought you were. And that is what changed everything after the storm settled, that unexpected presence beside me, offering truth, offering clarity, offering the reassurance that even in the most painful moments, someone saw me, someone believed me, someone stood with me. And sometimes, just sometimes, that one unexpected voice becomes the one that carries you into the strength you didn't know you were about to walk into. And that is how I learned that even in silence, the right support can turn wounds into wisdom. There's a moment in life when everything that has been swirling around you finally settles, not because the chaos disappears, but because you rise above it. You stand tall in the same place where someone tried to break you. You breathe calmly in the same atmosphere where someone tried to suffocate your dignity. And you move forward with a strength that no one expected, especially the person who thought they could shake you. Because what she never understood was that my silence was not defeat, my calmness was not surrender, and my restraint was not weakness. They were preparation, they were foundation, they were the quiet building blocks of the outcome she never saw coming. In the days that followed the attack, and the conversations that came after, I began to see everything with a clarity I didn't have before. Sometimes clarity comes to you like a whisper, and other times it comes like a strike of lightning that illuminates every corner of your past interactions. Suddenly you see every hint you ignored, every sharp comment you brushed aside, every little jab that you took as a misunderstanding. Suddenly the pieces fall into place. The patterns reveal themselves, and what once felt like isolated moments starts to look like a long, deliberate path that someone else was trying to pave for you without your consent, without your knowledge, and certainly without your well-being in mind. But here's the thing about moments of betrayal or disrespect: they can destroy you, or they can define you. They can make you hard, or they can make you wise. They can turn you into someone unrecognizable, or they can push you deeper into who you truly are. And as everything around me settled, I realized that I wasn't becoming bitter. I wasn't becoming cold. I wasn't becoming hardened. I was becoming sure of myself in a way I had never been before. I was becoming grounded. I was becoming aware. I was becoming unapologetically firm in the kind of treatment I was willing to accept. She didn't expect that. She didn't expect that after trying to embarrass me, I would stand up straighter. She didn't expect that after trying to provoke me, I would grow calmer. She didn't expect that after trying to make me feel small, I would become larger in the eyes of those around me. Because people watched not just the act of anger, but the response to it. And responses reveal character in ways attacks never can. I knew that I couldn't undo what she did. I couldn't erase the memory of hot soup hitting my face. I couldn't delete the humiliation from the room. I couldn't pretend that the disrespect hadn't happened. But what I could do, what I did do, was decide how the story would end. And I made that decision quietly, long before anyone knew what I was planning. I remember waking up one morning after everything had calmed down. The house felt different. Not quieter, but clearer, like the emotional fog had lifted. I sat with my coffee, not rushed, not anxious, just present. And in that moment, I realized something vital. I wasn't waiting anymore. I wasn't waiting for an apology. I wasn't waiting for her to change. I wasn't waiting for someone to defend me. I had already stepped into the next chapter of myself, and whether anyone else followed or not wasn't my concern. My concern was my peace, my dignity, and the boundaries I should have drawn long ago. When you come to that kind of realization, your tone changes, your presence changes, the energy you bring into a room changes, and people notice not because you make an announcement, but because there is something unmistakably solid in the way you carry yourself. That's exactly what happened. People began to treat me differently, not because they suddenly liked me more or understood me better, but because they recognized that I saw my worth clearly now, and they had no choice but to adjust accordingly. But she noticed something different. She noticed that she had lost the one thing she relied on more than anything: my tolerance. Not my kindness, not my love, my tolerance. The space I always gave her to behave however she wanted. The benefit of the doubt I always offered. The ability she had to poke at me knowing I would overlook it. That tolerance was gone. And when someone loses the privilege of your tolerance, they lose power they didn't even realize they were holding. It wasn't revenge. It wasn't punishment. It was transformation. And transformation is something no one can anticipate if they've never seen your strength before. I remember the moment she realized it. She approached me one afternoon, her steps slower than usual, her chin not lifted in that familiar superiority. There was a hesitation in her posture, a carefulness in her eyes. She was watching me, not with challenge, but with uncertainty. She was trying to understand what had changed. She started speaking in that tone she used when she wanted to pretend everything was normal. but we both knew nothing was normal anymore. She made a comment about something simple, something about the house, something about dinner, something meant to reestablish familiarity, but familiarity didn't exist between us anymore. And I responded with calm politeness, not anger, not coldness, just a clear, gentle, impenetrable boundary. For the first time, she had to meet me from a distance, not a physical distance, but an emotional one she couldn't cross without accountability. And that accountability was the very thing she never expected to face. People like her rely on the idea that you will always accept their behavior, always excuse their actions, always minimize the hurt they cause. When you stop doing that, when you stop allowing them access to your emotions, they stand there empty-handed. Their power dissolves. Their confidence shrinks. Their own behavior becomes a reflection they can't escape. And that's exactly what happened. She saw herself in the silence. She saw the consequences of her actions in the calm way and no longer engaged with her provocation. She saw the shift. She never imagined would happen, the shift where I no longer made space for her chaos. But what she never expected, more than anything else, was the strength I found in myself. She